In the beginning of Stream 2, we found ourselves assaulting Side, the island stronghold of Egypt. As long as there was an enemy presence here, our Mediterranean coastline was not safe from enemy incursions. It's safe to say we had perhaps gone a little overkill with bringing forces to bear on this minor settlement, however an example had to be made. The battle saw us once again utilise land and sea forces for a two-pronged assault. However, our army and navies were arriving in two waves, which meant pressure would be on our lead force to hold the line. But if we're being honest, the enemy did not stand a chance. They desperately tried to sally out and engage our forces before reinforcements could arrive, but simply backed themselves into a situation where they could not escape. By the time our reinforcements actually made it to the front line, the battle was largely over. Our local levy units proving to be incredibly useful as a complementing force to the backbone of our forces, the Seleucid hoplites. As always, our Sarissa Lancers featured heavily, acting as our quick reaction force and cementing themselves as the literal workhorses of our conquest, once again proving to be invaluable in their hit and run abilities. We managed to capture the settlement without having to kill the entirety of the enemy's force, which bode well for the local population and economy. One issue presented was the island's isolation, which made for a vulnerable front. So the decision was made to leave a small force here to maintain public order and to deter any future incursions. As victory was achieved in the north, our two-front war with Egypt was closed to a single border, with the Nile now acting as a natural boundary. Swampy terrain and the temper of the river itself, meaning that crossing it took both lives and supplies from any army looking to ford it. We sent spies across the delta in an attempt to survey the enemy's strength, and were greeted by two full-stack armies that were split into multiple smaller units. The one unfortunate situation that rose from the Egyptian demise was the rise of pirates in and around Cyprus. They posed a significant threat and were able to chase away our only current standing navy. They have a fair strength and a large battle would need to be fought against them when our economy could support the construction of such a fleet. With our navy currently unable to operate in and around Side, it was decided they could better serve harassing the coastline in and around Alexandria, so they were redeployed. Seeing the events unfolding on our borders, Pergamon came to us offering a non-aggression pact, something we were welcoming to, as this further secured our northern front. With our agents deployed behind enemy lines, we could follow their troop movements, and follow them we did. A window presented itself to us where the Egyptians moved all of their armies to their other fronts, where they were also fighting and defending. Alexandria was open for the taking. All we had to do was cross the Nile, camp for the season, then head to the seaside. With all things considered, it was too good an opportunity to pass up, so we rushed our siege and once again attacked in a combined assault. With the map of the settlement provided by our spies, the War Council decided that we would be best to assault a small section of the defensive walls with everything we have. Meanwhile, our navy made their way into the settlement via the sea and the large land bridge that led straight to the centre of the town. That was the battle plan, and so it was set in motion. The local mercenaries we had hired were tasked with pushing the ladders to the walls, and thanks to the work of our slingers, they managed to get to the walls relatively unscathed. But their job was not over. They were first over the top, with our levy units following closely behind. As projectiles rained down from both sides, and the battle for the walls started to escalate, it was our navy's turn to disembark. We were anticipating heavy resistance on their approach to the centre of the town, and at every corner, every alley we passed, we expected an ambush. However, it never came. Then all of a sudden the enemy's towers that watch over the harbour started hammering down on our marines as they approached. Our shields were raised. Next thing we knew, we were in sight of the centre of the town. A quick jostle of the towers, and we redeployed to the control point. The enemy had literally concentrated everything they possessed on the land assault, the fools. With a quick formation thrown together, and the approaches covered, our marines now deployed defensively. If we held the centre of the town and the enemy saw our standard raised, they would likely throw down their weapons, avoiding a lot of bloodshed on both sides. As our marines manoeuvred and took control of the centre of the town, victory was in our grasp, and the enemy, finally seeing what had happened, redeployed to the centre. Our marines would have to stand strong and hold their position. And then the final assault approached. We had turned the enemy's own walls and choke points against them. All our marines had to do was defeat this wave, and the town was ours with absolutely minimal bloodshed. In the aftermath, there was a real sense of achievement for what had just been done. A superbly organised assault simultaneously from both land and sea, had taken one of the largest cities in the known world by complete and utter surprise. Our navy, now dubbed the Children of Poseidon, found themselves being revered amongst our military leaders, having earned their respect. Then, as if the battle itself was not drama enough, the council descended into absolute chaos in the aftermath of the battle, split into different parties, all with their own opinion on what should happen next. There were cries in the chamber to peace with the Egyptians. We had taken their capital, and other threats were rising. There were shouts to finish them off while they were distracted elsewhere. And of course you had the cries echoing the chamber of Pontus delenda est. In fact, a prominent councillor, who shall not be named to save face, was rumoured to have bought votes in an attempt to overturn a fair election process. The irony. With the real citizens putting politics behind them, we were greeted with diplomats from our satrapies once again. They, on this occasion, found themselves being attacked by the Galatians. To their credit, the council threw their previous quarrels aside and focused on the issue at hand, voting unanimously to aid our satrapies, hoping to show them that the old ways of treating them as second-class citizens were a thing of the past. Seleucid protects its own. In the aftermath of the political shenanigans, our attention turned to the remnants of an Egyptian army that were garrisoned on the banks of the Nile. The battle involved the enemy defending a fortress they had set up to blockade the main road between our lands and Alexandria. This could not be allowed to stand. This battle was largely uneventful and played out exactly how we would have hoped. We deployed our heavy spear and pikes in the centre and our lighter levy units and Sarissa cavalry on the flanks, hoping to repeat our so far undefeated hammer and anvil strategy. And honestly, other than some enemy cavalry that attempted to break our flanks, we encircled the majority of the enemy's troops and ran them down with ease. The resulting rout concluding with us chasing the enemy army over the Nile, resulting in many of them drowning. With northern Egyptus now firmly in our hands, our greatest military minds immediately started planning our next moves. With the Galatians threatening our peaceful north, many members of the council demanded an army be raised to counter them. However, our satrapy in Sardes claimed it was nothing to worry about and that they had the situation under control. While the breath had barely left our allies' mouth, an enemy army was spotted on the parameters of the hills around Side. Sardes had lost 2 cities to the Galatian threat, and a defence was scrambled together. Before we had time to gather enough forces, the enemy were on the horizon. All we had was a general accompanied with a unit of elite cavalry. Luckily, the population of the valley and coast rallied to our banner, and we found ourselves with a reasonably strong garrison, albeit made up largely of irregulars. With time to prepare, traps were set and our warriors were drilled. The desperate defence of Side begins. As the enemy's lines eventually clash with our own, it was realised that we were in fact fighting the naked warriors. The prowess preceded them, and it was known that they would often fight to the death rather than retreat, quite disheartening to any farmers or fishermen who had been handed a spear and shield and told to go defend. However, our traps played their part massively, and constant harassment by our cavalry left the enemy unable to concentrate on breaking through our phalanx. Our local archers, mostly comprised of hunters, let out an incessant volley of fire arrows, lighting the peat pits we had covered below the enemy. As the enemy's front line was worn down, a cavalry charge broke through and impaled the enemy general. Many of his men, seeing this unfold, began retreating from the city, clashing with one another and making giant crowds of men trying desperate to flee. Naturally, our general's instinct kicked in. Any excuse to commit some minor war crimes was something that could be joked about later in the royal court. Beyond this point, it became a mopping up process, with the enemy's final few units being run down, sometimes by the local peasant mob themselves, who had shown how loyal the local populace were to our kingdom. With victory over the Galatians, we found ourselves attempting to take the initiative in the north. An army was to be recruited out of Tarsus. Some council members were heard murmuring in the shadows that if it had been done but a year earlier, we would not have had these issues. Alas, Captain Hindsight was not present. Simultaneously, a second smaller army was being raised in Alexandria. The idea was that we would attack the Egyptian breadbasket, as it had been nicknamed. If we controlled that, some of our famines that had hit parts of our kingdom would be a thing of the past. As this recruitment began, we realised that the Egyptians had moved 3 smaller armies into the western reaches of the Alexandrian province. They were encamped and looked to be hankering down for a summer campaign. Frustrating, because we were ready to launch our own attacks to the south. With the situation here being unstable until these armies had been dealt with, the Jaws of Jerusalem, our veterans of the Jerusalem campaign, marched towards these armies, confidence at an all-time high. The decision was made to assault the most southern fortress the enemies had, knowing that reinforcements would not be far behind. Our council suggested that we should try to take the fort and turn it against the enemies. Credit where credit is due, the enemy generals, including the Egyptian king, manoeuvred brilliantly, feigning an attack on our army and then retreating back towards the fort's flank, where they rendezvoused with their reinforcements. The situation began looking quite grim. With some of the opening manoeuvres, we felt we had control of the situation. Our archers managed to kill off a few of the enemy's hoplite units, and our lancers managed to rout a few skirmishers from the field. Just as confidence was rising, the enemy made it clear that their interests in holding the fort were non-existent, so we decided to follow the council's advice and move 2 units of our levies into the fort to begin capturing it. This would prove to be a costly endeavour. With a number of our infantry units engaged in the fort, we scrambled together a new front line with the fort itself acting as our flank. Our line was in a good position, but was limited in numbers and strength, and as you looked out into the desert, there was a literal sea of Egyptians coming towards us. How long could the front line hold, and would our hammer and anvil carry us to victory once again? As our cavalry moved out to the flank, they were engaged by the enemy's cavalry, and a desperate skirmish broke out for command of the eastern flank. The entire time the weight of the Egyptian mass pushing through our thinly stretched line. As if this was not bad enough, enemy projectiles rained in from afar. The phalanx could not hold for long. In the fort, the enclosed walls meant that our men in there were essentially in a kill box, with the enemy skirmishers firing on them incessantly. Unfortunately, there was nothing they could do in return, and they perished inside those walls. With the loss of the fort, morale seemed to break. Our entire line started to crumple. Only our general's bodyguard remained, and the decision was made to pull our king out of the battle and live to fight another day. As this was unfolding, the enemy's king charged into one of our cavalry units that had already been engaged. It was unclear exactly how the situation played out, but cries echoed through the battlefield that the Egyptian king in exile was now dead. Overall, this battle would prove to be a strategic loss, but a victory of morale. The king commander of the enemy's perfectly formed defence had been killed, which also happened to weaken the Egyptian dynasty. Other than the loss of the veteran hoplites, we managed to retreat safely back into the walls of Alexandria, living to fight another day. As the council processed the aftermath of the Battle of the Alexandrian Plains, Galatia launched another attack, this time on Tarsus. Here, we really were stretched thin. We only had a general unit from the local nobility and 2 units of mercenary spearmen. We did, however, once again have traps. They would be deployed expertly and show that if anyone wants to take any Seleucid settlement, they would have to pay dearly. Once again, the local populace were offering their lives to defend our interests in the area, something that we could not forget. The battlefield was set and the enemy approached. Hordes of horse archers as well as heavy cavalry. The tightly packed streets would be our fort, and choke points would be set. The enemy attempted to bring their cavalry to bear on us first, a mix of both heavy shot cavalry and skirmish cav. Somehow, they managed to completely miss our spiked anti-cavalry traps and ran headfirst into them. Meanwhile, on the other approach to the town, they were held up by hastily constructed barricades. The hope was they would buy us time until the real assault started. Our archers managed to light the brimstone pits we had created, meaning that the enemy's approach to us was perilous. The traps were playing their part. The front lines then clashed in the main square of the town, our hoplites holding the front while forces were sent to flank once the enemy had fully engaged. Our hoplites, despite being only militia with no real training, performed superbly and held the front line with only minimal casualties. We managed after quite a lengthy engagement to attack the enemy's flank with both spearmen and cavalry, and before we knew it, their will to fight was no more. As the cavalry started attacking the final barricade, our spearmen were moved in to counter them and keep them at bay. But by this point, the enemy's infantry were throwing down their weapons and fleeing for their lives. The cavalry had gotten there, but it was too late. In somewhat disbelief at the outcome, the local nobility rejoiced at the defence of Tarsus. The council, however, had different ideas. This had not only been an attack against our mighty kingdom, but was an attack on our core province. This could not be allowed to stand. Once again, murmurs were heard from the council, complaining about our multiple wars we were engaged in at both ends of the empire. As our newly raised force marched towards the Egyptian provinces on the southern Nile, we found ourselves in a strong position of power in Aegyptus. No one could really rival us here. Our satrapies had even sent armies to help us in our wars against the Nile aggressor. It then came as a shock to find the new Egyptian king had ascended to the throne and decided his first move was to attack Alexandria, to reclaim his ancestral home. Our defensive army was battered from the previous defeat, but they knew their work was not finished yet. The enemy didn't just command a garrison, they had a full army patrolling the countryside around the settlement. Rumours had it that they were rushing to the defence of Iconium, but would they be too late? Our general decided that with the enemy having potential reinforcements and us being unaware of their strength or numbers, we would keep a strong rear guard and maintain watch upon the approaches. We would attempt to rush the town and capture it before dismantling any other army that dare approach. With a strong vanguard deployed on our left flank, we hastily approached the town, pikes in front supported by skirmishers. If it played out as we hoped, we would pin down and destroy the enemy garrison while our cavalry headed to the square of the town to raise our standard. And that was exactly how it played out. And just as we thought we were about to take the town and seize the day, dust was seen being kicked up in the distance. The enemy reinforcements had arrived. With our vanguard deployed tightly against the town and the skirmish battle beginning, we tried to resaddle our cavalry and head for the enemy's flank. Once we had arrived, this caused the enemy general to order his troops to reform their formation, and we seized the opportunity by having our levies engage the enemy's flank. The infantry battle had begun. With our cavalry dominance, it was just a matter of time, and after chipping away at vulnerable units on the enemy's flanks, we found ourselves once again folding our lines of infantry around the enemy's formation. It was like a noose tightening around the Iconian's neck. And just like that, in the space of one season, two desperate defences in the north see us maintain control of our settlements, pushing our enemies onto the back foot with the initiative in our hands. As we finish this evening, we have made territorial gains in southern Asia Minor. We've taken one additional settlement as well as defending both Side and Tarsos. Side multiple times. Down in Egypt, we have taken Alexandria, however we now found ourselves sort of stuck under siege there. And we do have an army moving down here towards Diospolis, which we should be able to take at the start of next stream. Our Satrapies are somehow still with us, and we have been dragged into multiple wars with them once again, including against Galatia, which is what caused all of this problem here to unfold. Thank you once again for joining us for recap number 2 of our DEI series. We will be streaming the next episode next week, and I will do my utmost to get the episode uploaded as quick as possible. As always, thank you for the support and the feedback, and we will see you all next time.